Hello there, Underdog Leadership Podcast listeners. Jenny Mitchell here, sharing with you a little bit about my story. As a coach, I get to hear about many other people's stories, but here on the podcast, I am stepping into my voice. I am stepping into my story. And so it feels really appropriate to come with you with a little backstory about why the heck Jenny's company is called Chavender. What's with the fish? You're going to find out more about that. And a little bit about me as I grew up and where I've moved to and what I've become over the years. So let's bring this thing way back to the beginning. Let me tell you a little bit about young Jenny. So if you've been in any of my presentations, you may have seen a picture that I think encapsulates so much about me. Imagine, if you will, an 8-year-old grin from ear to ear, sporting a homemade Halloween costume, a homemade fascinator. That's that thing that you put on your head if you're trying to emulate Lady Di or some members of the royal family. And of course, a turtleneck with underneath the bathing suit outfit, which is the Wonder Woman costume. Why the turtleneck, you may ask? Well, in Canada, where I live, it is always cold on October 31st when we go Halloween trick-or-treating, and thus we have turtlenecks underneath our costumes. When I look at that picture, I want to tell you what I see. I see a young woman, a young girl, excited about life. I see a young woman who sits in the back of the car and watches the cars go by in the back seat and thinks, oh my gosh, the world is so big. How am I going to have time to meet all these people? I see a young girl full of possibility, of questions, of curiosity, and an insatiable interest in pretty much everything. And so where does that young girl go? What's her story? And why does she, 50 odd years later, start a podcast called Underdog Leadership? In some ways, it's an oxymoron, right? We think of the underdog as the person that overcomes things. And at least on the surface, this young girl has everything going for her. Well, life happens. Society happens. Inhibitions happen, I should say, the things that hold us back. I look at photos of myself as I turn into a teenager, and I look at photos of myself as I graduate high school and I finish my first degree, and I will share more on the podcast about that. But I became a hurdle jumper. I became the person that if you put something in front of me, I said, I'm going to jump that thing. And it was so very rarely about what is that thing about? How high is the hurdle? How will that suit my needs? It was so much more about what does society see about that hurdle? How will I be recognized for having jumped that hurdle? And as I'm jumping the first hurdle, I'm already looking at hurdle 2 and 3 and 4. And so it's a story of conforming. It's a story of following the path that everybody had mapped out for you. Now, I did 3 degrees in classical music. And let me tell you, first of all, what a gift and what a privilege that was. Not everybody, I'm going to own, has the talent and the skills to enter an undergraduate degree at McGill University in piano performance. That was 4 years of a gift. I'm always grateful for my parents for allowing me to follow my interest and my passion. And at that time, music was the thing that interested me the most. Or more specifically, I remember thinking to myself, music is probably the biggest bottomless pit. It was the thing that I thought I could never run out of ideas or ways or of things to learn. And so I consciously chose that, I think. In hindsight, music was the thing that I was familiar with. Music was the thing that was in front of me. And so it made logical sense to just keep doing what I was doing. Because you're going to hear in my story that after I finished an undergraduate degree, after I finished a master's degree, which allowed me to move to New York City, where I lived for 11 amazing years. If you have the chance to go abroad or go somewhere, my invitation to you on this Underdog Leadership Podcast is to go and do it. It's totally worth it. And then completing a doctorate degree from SUNY Stony Brook, which is an elite music school on the end of Long Island, just east of New York. And so you can hear the hurdle jumping even in my description. I did this, I did this, I did this. And it was straightforward because I didn't have to think, I didn't have to question, and the validation was external. At the end of my degree, life happened. I was lucky enough to meet someone who I fell deeply in love with and who I married and who I was lucky enough to have children with. And I will never, ever take that for granted. It's been a beautiful gift in my life to be a part of a family. But family also brings new challenges and new opportunities. And I fell into raising money for pianos at the conservatory where I was working. And it was a story that sounded a little bit like this. I was preparing for a recital for my students, and I realized that the pianos in the hall were terrible. They needed to be tuned. They needed a bunch of work. And so I went to the management and I said, hey, is there any way we could do something about these pianos? And so they said, well, we'd have to fundraise, Jenny. And I was like, okay, I love a good hurdle. What do I have to do? What do I have to jump? Who do I need to get involved? And that expression, the rest is history. It really does relate to that, because what I found in the community of coming together to raise money for a cause that I believed in was a connection, was meaningful dialogue, was people coming together to make something better. And so I'm fast forwarding to my Chavender days, my company days, but that has always been the mission behind Chavender, to help more people do more good in the world in whatever format that is for them. So I fell into fundraising. I got completely jazzed and excited, and I sort of asked myself, what's possible here? And along the way, I came back to Canada, back to my hometown, which made perfect sense. I have 2 sets of grandparents here for my children, and settled into life as a new definition as a mom. And the work I did initially as a professional fundraiser in those years was working for consultants, which might be kind of surprising for many of you listening, because I think a lot of people think we come up through the ranks, getting our badges of honor in the trenches and not for profit. I certainly did that. I certainly thought I could solve the world's problems on a day a week or 2 days a week at the different organizations where I worked. And the thing that kept coming back for me was whenever I was in these not-for-profits, and part of my story and part of my journey, you're going to hear me talk a lot about not-for-profits, even though now my executive coaching breadth of practice is a lot wider than that. But that was where I cut my teeth. It was the people that always brought me back. And you know what's funny? As I sit here describing this on a podcast to you guys, do you remember me in the backseat of that car watching all those people go by? Sometimes I think that I fell, or I moved into not-for-profit and I moved into coaching because I wanted to have these connections with people. I wanted to get to know people, not just on the surface, but for what they stood for what they believed, and what they were willing to invest in for a mission that mattered to them. And I don't care what your mission is. If you're listening, it doesn't matter if it's Export and Development Canada, if it's puppies, love puppies, by the way, if it's cancer, if it's research to solve problems, if it's higher advancement, all of those things are incredibly worthy because you believe in them. So fell into fundraising, got involved with the staff in the not-for-profit world, and quickly realized that the kind of impact I wanted to have was broader than just the word fundraising, or broader than just the word revenue generation, or broader than the word feasibility study. If these aren't words that you're familiar with, they're kind of jargon that we use in the fundraising world. I wanted to touch and connect with the people, because my aha moment was, it's the people that always drive the most powerful kind of change. And so why would I spend my time from now on writing reports and being a consultant and handing them over to management who say, thank you very much, Jenny, and then the recommendations get put on a shelf? I wanted to affect and connect with the people at the organizations I was working with. And I'm very proud to say that through that aha moment, I went out and got the tools necessary to support those people that I was so inspired by, and received an executive coaching certification through Royal Roads University out on the West Coast. And again, thinking that this coaching certification was going to be like a checkbox. I hate to be I might as well own it, pretty callous about the whole thing. I'm a coach. I know what I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. I've been, coaching myself and others for many, many years. And what I discovered through that Royal Roads coaching program was a commitment to self, a commitment to learning, a commitment to self-improvement that went far beyond the confines of the academic learning and all that great research and readings that I was privileged to be a part of through that coaching program. And once again, you're going to hear a theme here, people. The people that I met in that 50-person cohort were incredible human beings. Were passionate. I remember there was a doctor who was wanted to learn executive coaching. There were professional fundraisers in there. There were HR managers, of course. Those are kind of our typical ones. But there were just people that really wanted to feel that connection. And so that was another turning point. And so those hurdles that were outside started to become internal milestones. And that's where I think this big shift happens for me. And so as I kind of move into where I'm going forward from here, this feels like a perfect point in this podcast. And gosh, thank you so much for listening. I'm looking at the time. You've already been with me 11 minutes. And I have to tell you, 20 years ago, if you had told me I was going to own my space on a podcast with my own voice and speak to a community of people, I don't know who you are out there. This is kind of early days in my podcast, but I am so grateful for your ears and your heart and your curiosity to press play on this podcast. I would have been blown away by myself. And so that's what this Underdog Leadership Podcast is about. It's about if you were to overcome things, what would be possible? I've always been fascinated with the act of overcoming, less interested in the success part, but way more interested in what's possible and what would I have to change or shift or grow into or expand to make that happen. So Chavender, everybody asks me, how do you spell it? How do you say it? I always say it's Chavender, like lavender. Well, people, listeners, the Chavender is a fish. It is on the east coast of Canada. It's in the Georges Bank, which is part of the water that exists between Canada and the United States. And I discovered the Chavender through my father-in-law, who actually had a company at one point called Chavender. And he researched the fishing rights between Canada and the United States, because if we were to look back on the fishing rights and who had sovereignty over those fishing rights, we could work backwards and calculate where the land masses were owned by which organizations and which companies. And so the Chavender, why he picked that name or why he liked it was it's a kind of fish that lives in that area. And if you Google Chavender, you will find out it's similar to a chub, Chubb, not a pretty name. I much prefer Chavender. It is a fish that can survive freshwater. It can survive if there's an influx of salt water. It has no problem living in the intersection point of like a river and the ocean, where it would be very murky and blurry. And you can imagine that the sand was all churned up on the bottom. It is a fish that survives. And for me, look at that, tying back into Underdog Leadership as a podcast title and tying back into my passion about overcoming and tying back into that message of survival, but more importantly, thriving through leaning into new experiences. So that is the backstory on Chavender and what's with the fish. On a personal note, I'm also a Pisces, born in the month of March. I come by it honestly. When I look at that Pisces sign in the zodiac, one fish goes one way and one fish goes the other way. That is me, right? I can live in my head. I can see 360 on every single situation. It brings great compassion to my life. It brings great joy to my life, but it also creates its own challenges, right? When you can see all sides of the situation, it's tricky sometimes to get clarity. And so as I've moved away from jumping those external hurdles and jumping those externally imposed, you're supposed to do this at this age, you're supposed to do that, you're supposed to do that title is what you're supposed to be striving for, and finding those inner milestones, I'm just starting learning how to get quiet with myself. I turned 50 very recently, and that was a big milestone for me. Maybe some of you know me from my voice as the co-host of the Your Next 50 podcast, which with my very, very dear and best friend, Sylvia Oddfos. And that was a podcast project that came directly out of the pandemic. Sylvia and I and our girlfriends were getting on these calls once a week during the pandemic when everything was up in the air, and we're seeking out our community. You're going to hear that theme from me all the time, because I think particularly as women, we are always stronger when we're sharing our stories, when we're connecting, when we're held in community by others, good things happen. And so we're on this journey together, and Sylvia and I kept talking about money and mindset, about how we're often the creators of our own problems. Anybody identify with that statement? And so together we were like, oh my gosh, we have to start a podcast to talk about this. And then immediately all the gremlins come up, right? Oh, well, it would be tough. What if it doesn't go well? How would we invest in it? What about all the editing and et cetera that would go into it? And so Sylvia and I made the commitment to each other that we would go live once a week to record the Your Next 50 podcast. And Your Next 50 is all about this aha moment that we had. If you only had 50 more years on the podcast, if you only had 50 more years on the planet, what would you do with them? Because there's this moment in your life when you say, if not now, when, right? And that's why I got involved in executive coaching. And that's why I believe in people. If you focus on the people, the work, the experience, the money, the board relationships, the title, all of that stuff follows. My story has not been one about owning my space. I think I've been a bystander. We talked about those hurdles, not being clear about what it was I wanted with myself. It wasn't like somebody did this to me. I had been unclear with myself. And in order to get clear, one of the things I'm still working through is taking space for me, is taking space to be here quietly, recording with you folks listening, taking space to notice those whispers. Sylvia and I love to use the word whispers. What is your intuition telling you? What is your intuition feeding you that you may or may not be listening to, or you may be ignoring, which is a terrible, terrible loss to the entire universe. I'm just taking a moment here as I sit with you to acknowledge the milestone of me showing up for you, to model, to inspire each of you listening to go out there and use your voices. When I was about a couple of years ago, I took some training with Simon Sinek. Yes, the Simon Sinek. It was his training. He was not there. And it was finding your why through leadership. And so I share with you in these final moments of this podcast all about Jenny, all about Chavender, and all about what I believe in, and hopefully a little taste of where I'm going as a leader, as an executive coach, and a professional fundraiser. My why is to lean into meaningful conversations with others so that they are empowered to use their seat at the table. I get really excited when people find their voice. I get really excited when people use their voice, and I get super duper excited when people expand beyond their predetermined boundaries. One of my core values is lifelong learning. So you will see me in evolutions of things. I'm always thinking about what's my next training? What's my next opportunity? And this podcast is an outburst or an extension of that thinking that I've been doing. And so as I close out this welcome podcast, this introduction to Jenny Mitchell, introduction to her story, I hope I've shared with you an arc from that toothy grin of an 8-year-old to a broad smile of peace and contentment as a 50-year-old, looking forward to my next 25, 50 years on the planet and what we can accomplish together. My wish for this podcast and for this community is that it is a partner for you in your own journey. Take from it what you will. Take the pieces that resonate, run with them, provide feedback to me. Let me know what works for you as I birth this into the new world, into my new world, and as I get more comfortable in owning my space on my solo podcast here today. So there you are, folks. There is What's with the Fish, my latest podcast for you, my listeners. If you wouldn't mind sending me a note, you can always find me at jenny@chavender.com. That's Chavender, spelt like lavender, but with a CH at the beginning. Or, of course, leave a note in the comments wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thank you so much for being here with open hearts and open ears to listen, to grow, and perhaps I've left you inspired to dig a little deeper, to ask yourself, which hurdles are most important to me? The external ones or the internal ones? Bye.